Hi, I'm Anna Callahan, and this is my Bernie story. Now, because Bernie really changed my life, I expect this story to be a little bit long. So if you get tired of hearing me, please just fill out the form below and get started volunteering for the Bernie campaign. Now, a lot of stories that people tell are about, they're really stories of suffering, stories about how our oligarchic, crony capitalist system crushes people. And the terrible things that people have to go through because of the dumb way we've set up our government. But this story is a little bit different. It's more of a story of inspiration and a little sacrifice. So that's what you're in for. Again, fill out the form, volunteer. So by 2016, my son was just over a year old, and I had turned off all media. I was a little bit of an activist in my 20s, but I felt like none of that had made any difference at all, and everything was really just getting worse. So I turned off the news, I turned off the radio, I didn't watch any TV, I was not on Facebook, or I didn't pay any attention to social media. I really did not want to know the news because it wasn't actionable. There's nothing I could do about it. So I didn't know that Bernie was running until January of 2016. So when I found out he was running, I also didn't know much about him. And my son would wake up about 5:30 in the morning in his crib, and he would want me to take him out and pull him into our bed and snuggle, which I would do. But he would fall asleep, I would stay awake, and every morning I would listen to another Bernie Sanders speech. And I remember this feeling of just joy at listening to him, because he was talking about things that I had believed in my entire life, but that nobody around me understood. My mom is an immigrant from Great Britain, where they have nationalized healthcare. So I grew up with this idea that the way we run healthcare is totally insane. And I also was pretty environmental, younger, and there was kind of an environmental movement, and the last person on the national stage to talk about the environment was Al Gore. And since then it had just dropped off as if nothing bad was happening. And so Bernie was talking about raising the minimum wage to a living wage and Medicare for all and the climate crisis. I remember he was on a debate and someone asked him, they asked all the candidates, what is the greatest threat to our national security? And everybody's talking about ISIS, they were talking about North Korea, and Bernie said, climate change. And my heart started racing, and I just felt elated. I couldn't believe that somebody was talking about climate change on the national stage. And it was like he lived in the same world I lived in. Whereas none of the other national politicians, they lived somewhere else. I didn't know where they lived. So I started volunteering, and pretty soon I had quit my job to volunteer full time. This was something that my husband and I talked about. And it's going to be really hard for him to quit his job. But I was, kind of consulting as a software engineer. So it was okay for me to do that at that point. So we decided, even though we both wanted to volunteer, that he would be the breadwinner, I would be activist. And so I got to volunteer most of my time when I wasn't watching our son. And I met all these volunteers, and this was in Berkeley, California, and I would talk to people who were in their 60s, their 70s, even their 80s, and they would say that it wasn't just that Bernie was the best candidate in 2016, he was the best candidate in their lifetimes, the best candidate for president who had ever come along in living memory. And it was incredibly inspiring to learn from these people about why he was so different. And it was also inspiring to sort of feel like you weren't alone anymore. There were millions of people volunteering for him. And we were all chatting on social media, and you could just see people doing crazy things, painting their entire barn with Bernie Sanders' face, or creating these crazy dresses out of the t-shirts, or, making earrings, or all the YouTube videos where musicians had just written songs about him. Really labors of love. And when that campaign was over, as you can imagine, we all fell into a pretty deep despair. As I was talking to some friends, I think we described it as like a hole in our hearts where the Bernie campaign used to be. Definitely the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. But I kind of get over my grief by doing. So I helped to lead a group called Berkeley for Bernie, which is all the Bernie volunteers. It grew to like 300 people, and we ended up flipping a bunch of local seats in Berkeley, city council, mayor. We passed a number of ballot measures, including public financing of elections. I actually got to be on the commission that implemented public financing of elections. So we did some really, really great stuff at the local level. And when Trump got elected, I got together with some friends, and we were talking about what is really wrong with our government, because it's definitely not just the presidency. Every level of government is deeply corrupt by money, by the wealthy. And we really came to this conclusion that if only our entire government, if every level of our government were filled with Bernie Sanders, that would resolve the whole problem. And we didn't mean like Bernie Sanders, the person, right? I mean, I actually have this tattoo that I got after the campaign was over. And it's not about Bernie the person, right? It's about anyone who can spend 30 years in the horrible, poisonous swamp that we call our political system and come out afterwards with his values really unchanged, still fighting for the most vulnerable people, still analyzing what's really wrong with our country correctly, and still fighting for all the things that we need. So, I ended up kind of running this organization called the Incorruptibles, and traveling around. I really worked with some of the most amazing people who had progressive wins, at the local level, and learning from them. Gail McLaughlin from the Richmond Progressive Alliance, and I worked with Jane McAlevey, and really learning as much as I could about how to create unwavering politicians who fight for economic, racial, social, and environmental justice. And putting together a whole training program, and training people, flying all over the country and training people on how to sort of take over their local government so that we can seed these great people into local, so that they can then be ready to move up to state and national. So I've basically, because of Bernie, I've spent my last 3 years volunteering, and here's the sacrifice part. Like, it's not easy for us to get by on one income in today's world, but it is still just as important as it ever was to make sure that Bernie gets elected. I honestly think it is the most important thing that anyone can be doing right now, and that when he is elected, he, as he has said, will not just be the commander-in-chief. He is going to be the organizer-in-chief. And that is what we should demand of every politician. Every politician, instead of, what they do? They spend 4 hours a day. They spend half their time calling wealthy donors. They are educating and mobilizing those people every call they make, listening to, educating, and mobilizing them. Our elected officials should be listening to, educating, and mobilizing us. That should be 50% of their job. That's what they should be doing. That is what Bernie does. He spends half his time listening to, educating, and mobilizing the 80% of Americans who are now vulnerable because of our terrible system. And when he becomes president, I really believe that it's going to change all of our lives for the better. So please do fill out that form below and volunteer for the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I look forward to seeing you there.